Well, thank all of you for being here tonight. And I'm imagining that all of you are here because you care about what we care about, which is how do we treat the other animals with whom we share the planet with more compassion. And of course, the problem is that we're pretty cruel and vile to each other as well. There's something in our nature that enables us to be very cruel to other beings, whether they're human or non-human. That's something we have to change. But I want to go back to the beginning. And I want to say that I was very, very fortunate in my life. We can't choose our parents. At least I don't suppose we can. And I happen to have a very supportive mother. She supported my love of animals. It seems I was born with a love of animals and a curiosity about animals. I don't remember this, but apparently when I was 1.5 years old, my mother came up to my room and found I'd taken a whole handful of earthworms to bed with me. She said, "Jane, you were looking at them as though you wondered, how do they walk without legs?" At any rate, instead of saying, "How dare you bring all this dirty earth and worms into your bed," as many mothers would, she said, "Jane, they're going to die if you leave them here. They need to be out in the garden." And we took them back. And then when I was just 4.5 years old, we lived in London, so not so many animals, dogs and cats, pigeons, sparrows, that sort of thing. And we went to stay for 2 weeks on a farm in the country. So for me, this was absolute magic, because in those days, farms were farms. And I know in some parts of Germany and some parts of Europe and some parts of the world, there are still animals on farms who wander freely in the fields and hens who peck around in the farmyard, not like the intensive farms we have today. And for me, coming from London, loving animals, and meeting cows and pigs and horses face to face, it was absolute magic, and I can still remember it, 4.5 years old. And I was given a job to help collect the hens' eggs. Well, the hens mostly laid their eggs in these little wooden hen houses. And so I would go with my little basket, and the nest boxes were around the edge. So you just went to the outside of this little hen house and opened the lid, and maybe there was an egg there, and I would put it in my basket. Apparently, I began asking everybody question. I don't remember, but I was asking everybody, but where on a hen is a hole big enough for the egg to come out? Because I couldn't see one. And obviously, nobody answered me to my satisfaction. And so one day, and I do remember this, I remember it so vividly, seeing a hen. She was a brown hen, and she was going into one of these little hen houses. I think there were about 6 of them. And I thought, or I must have thought, she's going to lay an egg. And I crawled after her. I'm going to discover for myself. Well, of course, that was a big mistake. And with squawks of bok, 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 she flew out. So I must have then realized this is a place which is now dangerous. I won't see an egg being laid here. And so I went into an empty hen house and hid in the back in the straw and waited. And waited. And waited. Well, fine for me, but my poor family did not know where I was. Apparently, they called the police because it was getting late. So now imagine my mother. Her little girl, 4.5-year-old daughter, has disappeared. And yet, when she sees me running towards the house, instead of getting angry, "How dare you go off without telling us? How dare you make us so worried? Don't you dare do it again," which would have killed all the excitement. She saw my shining eyes and sat down to hear the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. I can still see it if I close my eyes. The hen was very obliging. She turned her back to me, and she raised up on her legs, and out came this slightly soft, oblong object onto the straw. How exciting it was. The reason I tell that story, which some of you may have read about, is because isn't that the making of a little scientist? Curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning patience. It was all there, and a different kind of mother might have crushed that early scientific curiosity, and I might not have gone on to do what I've done. She found books for me when I was little about animals. She thought, Jane will learn to read more quickly if I give her books about animals, and of course she was right. And I don't know, I think in Germany you have Dr. Dolittle, yes? You know Dr. Dolittle? He was taught animal language by his parrot. And oh, how badly I wanted to learn the language of animals. And I was 8 years old, and I pretended to all my friends I could understand what the dogs were barking about and what the birds were singing about. And they all believed me, at any rate. So then we had very little money. World War II was raging. Some of you here will remember World War II. Most of you will not. And so we had this very little money. My father was off fighting. Mum, my sister, and I had gone to live with her mother. And there were bombs dropping. We had very little money, so our clothes were mostly second-hand. I don't think they were even making books during the war, I doubt it. And anyway, we couldn't afford to buy them, so the books came from libraries. But there were some second-hand bookshops. And I used to save up my tiny amount of pocket money, a few pennies each week. And when I was 10 years old, I found a little book in one of these second-hand bookshops, and it was called Tarzan of the Apes. And I had just enough money to buy it. And I took it home, and I climbed my favorite tree, and I read the book from cover to cover. And you know, 10-year-old little girls are very romantic. I fell passionately in love with this glorious lord of the jungle. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. Well, of course, I knew there was no Tarzan. I wasn't exactly stupid. But that was when my dream began. I'm going to grow up. I'm going to Africa. I'm going to live with wild animals, and I'm going to write books about them. Everybody laughed. How will you do that? You don't have any money. Africa's far away. We talked about the dark continent. We didn't know much about it. And I was just a girl. Girls didn't have those opportunities back then. But where everybody else said, Jane, dream about something you can achieve, my mother said, if you really want this thing, you're going to have to work really hard and take advantage of any opportunity, but don't ever give up. One of the best rewards I've had in my life is the number of young people who've come up to me and said, I want to thank you because you taught me that because you did it, I can do it too. At any rate, that was my supportive mother who set me on the course that I have followed along my long path through this mortal life on this planet. I'm not going into the story of how I got to Gombe National Park, but I think some of you have read about it, how a school friend invited me to Kenya. I had not been to college or university because we couldn't afford it, but I had a secretarial course, a secretarial degree. Went out to stay with my friend, met Dr. Louis Leakey. He amazingly invited me to go and study, to live with, to learn from, not any animal, but the one most like us, the chimpanzee. And we didn't even know back then, in 1960, when I first set out, we didn't know that chimpanzees and humans share more than 98% of DNA, the composition of DNA. And that the main difference, I'm told by my geneticist friends, is the expression of the genes. We didn't know back then the extent to which the composition of the blood and the immune system and the anatomy of the brain was so similar between humans and chimpanzees. Gradually, since that time, we've learned more and more about these biological similarities. But back then, when I first went out to Gombe National Park in what is now Tanzania, we knew nothing about the behavior of wild chimpanzees. And it was very tough at the beginning because they're very conservative, these chimpanzees, and they would take one look at this peculiar white ape and vanish into the vegetation. They were frightened. Well, I got more and more concerned. Leakey had only managed to get money for 6 months. And as weeks turned into months, I began to worry that the money would run out before I discovered anything really exciting, and that would be the end. So it was one chimpanzee, one male, whom I named David Greybeard, had a beautiful white beard, and they all look different. They look as different from each other as we do. And for some reason that we'll never know, David began to lose his fear before the others. And he sometimes came into my camp when there was an oil nut palm ripe. And one day he found some bananas lying on the table. My cook told me in the evening that the chimpanzee had stolen these bananas. He was quite angry. And I said, well, please leave some more bananas for him tomorrow. And indeed, as long as the palm tree was ripe with fruit, David came and he took the bananas, and then he began coming for the bananas, even when the palm tree was no longer fruiting, and his friends began to follow him, his friends from the forest, Goliath, who was top-ranking male, as I gradually came to understand, and the old female Flo, and the female Passion, and Mike, who started off as a very low-ranking male, but learned to incorporate empty 4-gallon tin cans, kerosene cans, into the male-dominant charging display. And in this way, from being the most low-ranking out of 11 adult males, rose to number 1 position in 4 months without, as far as we know, any serious attacks. There were no chimpanzees who'd lost tufts of hair. There were no serious wounds. And Mike reigned for 6 months. And we now know, because we've been studying these chimps for 55 years, that the males who rise to top rank by using their brains last longer than those who are really tough and strong and aggressive and get to the top by using brute strength. And maybe that's interesting in some political human spheres today. Let's hope so. At any rate, I was also beginning to learn more about the maternal behavior. I was beginning to understand, as weeks became months, that the females who were the most supportive had youngsters who eventually developed the males into higher-ranking individuals, the females into better mothers. I was learning gradually about their complex social society, and I was learning how their postures and gestures with which they communicate with each other were so like ours, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another on the back, begging for a share of food. I was learning how they bent branches over each night up in the trees to make a comfortable platform or sleeping nest each night. I was learning more about the foods that they were eating, mostly fruit, but I also learned that they eat quite a lot of insects, and occasionally they hunt. They hunt monkeys and young pigs and young bushbuck. And then came the most exciting observation back then. It was a breakthrough. And it was one day quite early on in my time at Gombe when I saw, as I was walking through the forest, a chimpanzee crouched over a termite mound. And I saw a hand reach out and break off grass stems and push them into the termite mound, leave them for a moment, pull them out with soldier termites clinging on with their jaws, pick them off with his lips, and fish again for more termites. But I also saw him pick off leafy twigs and strip away the leaves. He was modifying a natural object. He was actually not only using objects as tools, he was making tools. That wouldn't be exciting now, because we know that there are many animals who use and even make tools. But back then, it was very exciting because it was thought that humans and only humans were able to use and make tools. We were known as man the toolmaker. It was that observation that enabled Louis Leakey to get more money from National Geographic Society. And they sent a photographer and filmer, Hugo van Lauwijk, to Gombe to record on film and with his still photography the behavior of the chimpanzees. That's what took the behavior of these chimpanzees and the Jane who was studying them, who wasn't Tarzan's Jane, but she was an okay Jane, I guess. And it took these images into the hearts and minds, first of people in the United States, but then gradually further and further around the world. And so David Greybeard, it was, who showed me how chimpanzees use and make tools, and gradually I learned that other chimpanzees were doing the same thing. And now we know that in different parts of Africa, wherever there are chimpanzees being studied, there are different tool-using behaviors. And now we begin to understand the significance of the long childhood period. Chimpanzee females have their first baby when they're about 12 or 13. They then only have one child every 5 years or so. And it's a very long period of childhood dependency. 5 years riding on your mother's back, sleeping in her nest at night, suckling, gradually less frequently, but suckling. And it seems that it's important for chimp children as for human children because they have a lot to learn. If you're an insect, you can hatch from an egg and you can go through a whole complex life cycle, and in some species you never need to see another individual except for mating. You know what to do, your genes tell you, but it's not true for us, is it? We learn, our children learn, develop cultures, develop different languages, and so forth. And it's the same for the chimpanzees. Different parts of Africa, there are different behaviors, learned by the young ones by observing the adults, imitating, practicing, which is a definition of human culture. Behavior passed from one generation to the next through observation, imitation, and practice. So it was a shock to me to find that, like us, chimpanzees have a dark, aggressive, brutal side to their nature, that the males patrol boundaries of what are clearly marked territories, and if they see individuals from neighboring social groups, then they may give chase, and if they catch an unfortunate individual, subject him or her to a brutal attack, an attack so severe that that individual is almost bound to die of wounds inflicted. And I thought they were like us, but nicer. And then I realized that in certain situations, they behave in the same aggressive, violent way. But just like us, they also show love, compassion, and altruism. And there are wonderful stories of even unrelated adults looking after an orphan whose mother has died. So if that orphan, little orphan, has an older brother or sister, almost inevitably that older brother or sister will look after the child. And if the child is more than 3 years old, because up to 3 they're dependent on the mother's milk, if the child is more than 3, then they are likely to survive. But if there's no brother or sister, other individuals in the community may take care of them. And there are examples of even alpha males looking after infants who are not related to them. That's true altruism. You're not helping a relative which will help your genes in the future. You're helping a little infant who's not related to you, and by caring for that infant, you may actually lose out in some social situations. So there are these examples of true altruism. And I could talk about this for a very long time. It was pretty obvious, the more I learned about them, that they share emotions like happiness. You only have to watch an infant chimpanzee pirouetting around, leaping up into the branches, swinging, twirling around and around, turning somersaults, just like a kid, one of our children, who's happy. You know they're happy. You know they're filled with joy. And you've only got to watch a chimpanzee who's been attacked or who's lost a mother or a close companion sitting hunched and miserable to know that they're depressed, to know that they, like us, can be sad. When I'd been in the field about 2 years, and of course I didn't know then what we know about chimpanzees now, but I was beginning to learn quite a lot. And I got a letter from my mentor, Louis Leakey, telling me I had to go and get a degree. He said, I won't always be here to get money for you, and if you're going to get your own money, you need a degree. We don't have time to mess about with a BA. He got me a place to study ethology in Cambridge University in England, the top science university. And I was to study, apparently I was to get a PhD in ethology. Well, I had no idea what ethology was. And of course you couldn't Google in those days. You know, letters went by post and handwritten in those days. So I got to Cambridge eventually, and can you imagine, having never been to college, now being told I was doing a PhD, how nervous I was? I thought other students will resent me. Who does she think she is? Just because she's studying these chimpanzees, why does she think that she can just, miss out all the hard work that we've had to do to get our BAs and our MAs? Maybe some of them thought that way, I don't know. But the real shock was when the professors, who I was scared of, told me I'd done everything wrong. Jane, you shouldn't have given those chimpanzees names. Don't you know that's not science? That's not scientific. You should have given them numbers. Go and look at monkeys in a lab. They have numbers tattooed on their chests. So do chimpanzees. The professors told me, you can't talk about chimpanzees having personalities. You can't talk about them having minds capable of thinking. And you certainly can't talk about them having emotions. Why? Because I was guilty of anthropomorphism, attributing human characteristics to non-human beings. Back then, it was thought, seriously thought, that there was a difference between us and other animals, a difference of kind. There was humans, and there was a sharp line, or a big wall, whatever you want to think, and on the other side were all the other animals. Well, fortunately, when I was a child, I'd had a wonderful teacher. Of course, I had my mother, but I had a teacher who taught me so much about animal behavior. And a teacher who taught me that while I hadn't been to college, while these professors had all that education and scientific knowledge, nevertheless, they were wrong. I'd been taught by my teacher, they were wrong, that animals did have personalities, they did have minds, they did have emotions. That teacher, that was my dog. You can't share your life in a meaningful way with a dog, a cat, a rabbit, a bird, a rat, I don't care what it is, and not know that the professors were wrong. And so I was able to have the courage of my conviction. I had a wonderful supervisor. He came to Gombe. He said he learned more about animal behavior in the 2 weeks he was there than in all the rest of his life before. He helped me write about what I believed in such a way that I couldn't be torn apart by critics in this world of science. And so I got my PhD and I built up a research station, and students came and studied different aspects of chimpanzee behavior. And I think what was so lucky is that as we learned more and more about how chimpanzee biology is so like ours in the ways that I've already said, that helped me to sort of like open scientific minds to the fact that it's not only in the biology, it's also in the psychology and the behavior that they're like ours. Louis Leakey wanted me to go to Gombe because he spent his life searching for the fossilized remains of our earliest human ancestors, 6-7 million years ago. And when you dig up these ancient fossils, you can tell a lot from the wear on the teeth, the shape of the bones, what the creature looked like, whether it was upright or not. From the artifacts left on the living floors, you can tell a little bit about the early tool-using behavior, the stone tools, and so forth. But behavior doesn't fossilize. So Lewis argued that if Jane finds behavior that's similar, or perhaps the same, in chimpanzee behavior today and human behavior today, then perhaps that behavior was present in a common ancestor 6 million years ago. And that maybe we've both brought that behavior with us through our long evolutionary pathways to where we are today. And so he felt that would help him better understand how early humans, our earliest ancestors, might have behaved. I think he was right. Most anthropologists and paleontologists think he was right. But at any rate, because of his belief, I was able to learn about chimpanzees. I was able to bring that knowledge out into the scientific world and break down this idea that there was a sharp line between us and all the other animals. Help us to understand we're part of this amazing animal kingdom. And as other field studies began to take place, people were studying elephants and lions, dolphins and whales. Gradually it became very obvious to even the most antagonistic scientists that of course animals have personalities, minds and feelings. And gradually scientific minds began to open to other ways of looking at animals. And the more we learn, the more we realize that these other beings on the planet with us, they share our fear, they share our despair, they share our pain. And the more we learn about them, how can we live with ourselves if we're inflicting pain and torture on these other thinking, feeling beings? So I would tell students today who are interested in animal behavior, who are interested in changing attitudes of humans towards animals, to bringing animals into our circle of compassion, that this is perhaps one of the most exciting times there's ever been. For a long time, science said, well, yes, all right, we admit chimpanzees, monkeys, primates maybe elephants and such like, they do have these intellectual abilities. But when owners of parrots, and of course we shouldn't own parrots, but you know people do, and when owners of parrots began talking about the intelligence of their parrots and that parrots sometimes understand the words they're saying, that's not possible because the bird brain is structured differently. And they can't possibly have the same kind of intellectual abilities as mammals. Until two crows, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this, there was a study done in Oxford University, and it was a very simple task given to these two crows. It was a piece of wire with a hook on the end, and a glass tube with a peanut at the bottom, and all the bird had to do was poke the wire down and pull out the peanut. Easy, no problem. They found that easy. But one day, accidentally, this was not part of the experiment, the hook broke off. Well, so now the birds are landed with a piece of straight wire, and that's not very helpful when you want to get a peanut out of a tube. But after much frustrated stabbing, one of the birds with beak and foot bent a hook and got out the peanut. Oh, say the skeptics, well, it was a chance, it just happened by mistake. Well, maybe it did, but that bird took good advantage and the next day, presented with a straight piece of wire, made a hook immediately. And the next day, made a hook immediately. Oh, say the skeptics, well, that was just one of the two birds. That was clearly an aberrant bird. So why was only one bird making the hook? Because that bird was the female. And every time she pulled out the peanut, the male took it. So the moral is, if you have a wife, why bother to make a tool? Well, I don't know if any of you have seen the YouTube, but if you haven't, look it up. They presented a crow that had been brought in from the wild by an experimenter who keeps them for 3 months and then frees them again. And this is the most amazing thing you've ever seen. This crow has been taught various ways of getting rewards. Like if you drop a stone into a tube of water, a peanut that's floating on the water will come up. If you drop 2 stones, it will rise high enough for you to take it with your beak. If you take a little stick, you can reach it through bars and bring a longer stick, and that longer stick will enable you to reach some reward that's behind the bars. So the crow knew these different steps, but for the first time they were put so that the crow had to work out how to get from A to B in 8 different steps. And if you watch that video, and you can look it up, and do look it up, it's absolutely amazing. The most recent fascination is with the intelligence of the octopus. Have any of you seen the octopus and the coconut shells? Or the octopus with the clam shells? If you haven't, Google it, look it up. It's absolutely amazing. I'm not even going to tell you because you need to look it up for yourself. And we now know that trees can communicate with each other, either through the microfungi on the roots going along under the ground in a forest, or they send out pheromones, scents. And so if you're a tree of a certain species and you're attacked by caterpillars, you send out these scent markers, these pheromones, and other trees of your species receive these chemical signals, and they immediately put extra toxin in their leaves to fight the caterpillars who will eventually arrive to eat their leaves. So we're finding out all these amazing things. One of the last things that I read was about altruism in rats. Rats who are used in so many laboratory experiments. And these rats are shown that if there's a companion, a cage mate, shut in a little trap, the rat will work and work and work, the free rat, to open the door of the container in which his cage mate is trapped, even if that means that he's going to then share chocolate, his favorite reward, with the cage mate. Instead of sitting eating the chocolate, first of all, he releases his cage mate from the cage. So we're learning so much about these amazing animals. Why did I leave Gombe? Why did I leave the forests that I loved? Because I went to a conference in 1986, and at that conference we brought together the people studying chimpanzees from different parts of Africa. And we had a session on conservation, which was shocking, showing how chimpanzees' numbers were decreasing, how forests were being destroyed, chimpanzees were being hunted for food, mothers were being shot to sell their babies for pets, for entertainment, or in those days for medical research. We had a session on conditions in some captive situations, and one of the things that we saw was so shocking, I couldn't sleep for nights afterwards. Our closest living relatives in 5-foot by 5-foot cages, bars on all sides, bars above, bars below. And they were there because their bodies are so like ours that scientists felt they could use those bodies to learn about human disease, to find cures or vaccines. Scientists who were not prepared to admit the equally striking similarities in psychology and behavior. I went to that conference planning to continue my wonderful life in the field. I left as an activist. I went to Africa. I learned more about the problems faced by the chimpanzees. That helped me to understand the tremendous problems faced by so many of the African people living in or around chimpanzee habitat. The terrible poverty, hunger, lack of education, lack of health facilities. And realizing that unless we improve the lives of the people, unless these people become our partners in conservation, there's no way that we can save the chimpanzees or any other animal. And that led to the Jane Goodall Institute's programs for improving lifestyles, which we don't have time to talk about tonight. But having seen these secretly filmed footages of chimpanzees in medical research, I knew I had to go into laboratories and see with my own eyes. And I'll never forget the first laboratory I went into. And there were the adult chimpanzees in these 5-foot by 5-foot cages. There were infant chimpanzees in 22 by 22 inch boxes that looked like microwave ovens. There was a little slit where light went in. And there were vents that took air in, but these chimpanzee infants who'd been taken from their mothers had to be kept in a sterile environment. The door was opened of one of these microwaves, and I saw the little chimp inside. She was 2 years old. She was rocking from side to side. Her eyes were dead. The man in his white coat lifted her out. He said, "Would you like to give her a banana?" And I'm thinking, this is crazy. And I said, "Well, of course." And she took it, and she ate it, but she was dead. She wasn't interacting. And he put her back and closed the door. And then I was in shock. I was totally in shock. And I was led into a room where there were National Institutes of Health, American scientists sitting around. And I realized they were all looking at me and waiting for me to say something. What am I going to say? And so sometimes words come to you in situations like that. And so what I said to them, I said, I imagine that you're all caring, concerned people like I am, and that you all feel as I do about what I've just seen. Of course they didn't, but they could hardly admit that they weren't caring, concerned human beings. And that led to the first series of discussions between those people who care about chimpanzee welfare and the medical research community. I was vilified by many animal rights groups. How can you sit down with them? How can you drink a cup of tea with them, or have coffee with them, or talk to them? Don't you realize you're betraying the animals by talking to them? They're evil people. They shouldn't be doing that. If you don't talk to people, can you ever possibly hope to change the way they think? And I think we always have to give people the benefit of the doubt, and maybe they behave the way they behave because they haven't understood. At any rate, as many of you know, some of you may not, it's been a long, long, long road, but 2 years ago, the National Institutes of Health released all their 400 chimpanzees from medical research to go to sanctuaries. And of course, they're not all in sanctuaries yet because it means raising money to get them there. But what I want to share with you is how this happened. I sort of, maybe coincidentally, maybe not, happened to meet the new director of National Institutes of Health about 5 years ago, just 2 weeks after he'd been appointed. And I was sat next to him at the dinner table. And of course I began talking to him about the chimps. And he said, but Jane, I don't know anything about chimps. I just know I'm a geneticist. I know about genomes. He's actually the man who decoded the human genome. So very brilliant, he and his team. And so I told him, and he put together a team of scientists, and it included some people that I could choose, and it took them 18 months, and they investigated every single testing that was being done on these 400 chimps in these different labs. And the question that they were asked to answer are, which of these experiments are beneficial to human health or potentially beneficial to human health? And it was something like 400 protocols. How many of those do you think were beneficial or potentially beneficial to human health? None of them. Not one. Not one. And so we are faced today with a problem where so many people have been taught to believe that without experiments on animals, particularly primates, then we'll never find cures for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or any of these other diseases which attack the human brain. And so people mostly believe that because they believe in science and because they've been told it. And in fact, the more you read, the more you learn, the more you realize it's not true. And I wrote some stuff down, but I'm not going to bother to read it. I'm just going to say that there are so many examples of vaccines that were produced using primates, which work to prevent primates getting some kind of disease. But when they were used on human beings, they didn't work and sometimes had very adverse effects. And sometimes procedures that didn't work on non-human primates eventually were found to be very beneficial for humans. So that this animal research is blown up out of all proportion. I was hoping to be able to announce something this evening, which is quite new, and I'm sure there are probably some of you here who know a lot more about it than I do, but I've got to find this man's name because this is brand new research, and let's see, where is it? Not true. I've got all these things saying not true, not true. It wasn't true that primates were useful at all in developing the polio vaccine. It hasn't been true that they were useful for Alzheimer's or anything like that. But there's this scientist called, and he works in the Harvard Medical School, so, you know, top guy, and he was one of the top met 100 scientists in Time magazine 3 years ago. His name is Rudy Jazzy, and he's developed something called Alzheimer's in a dish. He's developed the equivalent of a human brain in a Petri dish. And he says this substance that he's developed will give you a better sequence of the changes you see in a human brain with Alzheimer's than anything that has been discovered in a mouse. So if we find a way of learning about Alzheimer's in cells, human cells in a Petri dish, which is going to save millions of mice and rats from these terrible experiments, isn't it clear that it's going to save hundreds and thousands of monkeys and apes as well? I was hoping to get a definitive answer from him, but we weren't able to get hold of him, and I only learned about it 2 years ago. So there is a huge and growing understanding of the fact that even if some of this research with monkeys was benefiting human health, and particularly if you think about this brain research, you saw some of those images. Are we justified in doing something like that, in constraining these creatures, depriving them of liquid, constraining their movements? Are we justified in doing that, knowing they feel the same kind of pain and fear and depression as we do? Are we justified in doing that when we know that if we put more effort into alternatives to using any animals in medical research, it would be more beneficial to human health? Because even chimpanzees, more like us than anything else, don't get AIDS in the same way as human beings. And so it's putting more money, more effort, and more support into finding alternatives to the use of any animals in medical research. And primates in particular, because they're so like us. So it's so easy to see the fear and the pain and the depression that we cause. But the good news is that things and attitudes are changing. There are far more people in the world today who understand that we are part of the animal kingdom, who understand that we're not so different, and who understand that we don't have the moral right to inflict certain kinds of torture on other creatures just because they're not human. And the real tragedy is that we do the same to each other. If you think about the tortures and the war and the suffering that we inflict on each other, there's something fundamental that has to change in human nature. Maybe we have brought our aggressive instincts with us for 6 million years, but we have a brain, we have a highly developed intellect which separates us from other animals. It's now time we begin to use it to heal the harm that we've inflicted on the environment and to find other ways of helping humans without torturing animals, or indeed without torturing other humans. And so my hope for the future lies partly in this amazing intellect. We don't want to learn about that intellect, more about that intellect, by torturing other animals, do we? We don't. We want to use our brain to find ways of finding out cures without torturing other animals, without torturing other humans. And so all the efforts that we do to try and protect animals, to try and protect the environment, will be absolutely useless if new generations don't grow up to be better stewards, to be more caring, to be more compassionate than so many of us. And that's why I work so hard with the Jane Goodall Institute's youth program, Roots and Shoots, which is now in about 100 countries, and which is involving young people from kindergarten through university and even adults And every group is choosing 3 projects to make the world better, projects that they choose. We don't tell them what they care about. They know what they care about. Project to help people, project to help other animals, and a project to help the environment that we all share. And everywhere I go now, there are young people with shining eyes wanting to tell Dr. Jane what they're doing to make the world a better place. And when people say to me, but Jane, you've seen so much cruelty, you've seen so much environmental destruction, how can you possibly have hope? You can't really have hope. You're just saying that. Not true. I see it in the eyes of the children. And you hear so often, we haven't inherited this planet from our parents. We've borrowed it from our children. We haven't borrowed their future. We've stolen it. And we've got to get together with them and help to put the world in a better shape if we want to die feeling that we've done our bit. And that's the other great important thing. We can use social media to get people gathered around an issue, and an issue can certainly be the misuse of animals in medical research. We can get people behind us caring about climate change. We can get people who will stand up in such numbers that Donald Trump will have to change his mind and admit that climate change is real. And finally, there is this indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle the impossible and won't give up. And that's why I carry Mr. H with me, because he was given to me by a man called Gary Horn, who went blind when he was 21, decided to be a magician, was told that that was impossible if he was blind. He said he would try. The children don't know he's blind, and then he'll tell them and say, things may go wrong in your life, but if they do, don't give up. There's always a way forward. And he does scuba diving and cross-country skiing and skydiving. And he thought he was giving me a stuffed chimpanzee for my birthday 24 years ago. And I made him hold the tail. And he said, well, never mind. Take him where you go, and you know my spirit's with you. So he is my symbol for the indomitable human spirit. And there are people in this room who've been fighting and fighting and fighting to stop the use of animals, not only primates. We know so much about the other animals too. We can't only fight for primates because they're more like us. In fact, perhaps we should fight harder for other animals who are less like us, because we aren't such wonderful creatures after all in so many ways. But anyway, there are people in this room who are fighting for the right cause. And so every single one of us has that indomitable human spirit. And these people who've been fighting for justice for primates and other animals, not only in medical research, but in intensive farming and puppy mills and all the rest, you know, we have to support them. We have to all do our bit. And every single one of us makes some impact on the planet every single day. And we have a choice as to what kind of impact we're going to make. So let's make a commitment that we will do what we can in our own way, through social media, through talking to people, through involving our children in Roots and Shoots, to bring to an end the use of animals to try and help human health. We can do it in other ways, and the sooner we do it in other ways, the better off we will be. So thank you all very much.